Joe Budden puts Rory in his place. Let's look back at episode 120 of the Joe Budden Podcast.
I had a DM conversation with Elliot Wilson.
So you was snaky from February 28th.
It can certainly be much.
This is backdoor. That's scummy.
Episode 120 of the Joe Budden Podcast is a definitive episode to understand the breakup between the friends who pod, Joe Budden, Rory, and Mal. Now, this is a lighthearted conversation that is had between Rory and Joe Budden about the sleeper segment. But there was deep fractures between the two men that would later on be exposed by the end of their Spotify deal. So what I'm going to do is look back at this discussion about the sleeper segment and them trying to procure a advertisement deal, and then look back at other observations I made about the show. So the sleeper segment discussion happens about 15 minutes in, under the guise of a funny segment everybody knows as Homie Court, where Joe Budden brings up scummy allegations. And he highlights how, there was a playlist idea that Joe wanted to do for the show. And he brought it to Rory, but Rory says he was trying to get a bag. And then Joe Budden says that Rory's ambitious. Now, I think this is a euphemism, and what Joe secretly is trying to communicate to the audience is that he thinks Rory is a snake, and I'll evidence that later when I talk about the rest of this segment. So, Joe says that he tried to get a sleeper segment going with Rory, well, specifically a sleeper playlist, one that he could use to advertise and try to get a bag for, but Rory neglects it and instead says he needs a bag. Then a little bit later, Joe says that he was on Instagram and he saw a Rory playlist on the Tidal IG account. That very much surprised him because of the way Rory acted when he brought it to him personally. Now, this is a conversation that eventually leads to Joe saying that Rory backdoored him. We're going to talk about why this is significant a little bit later, because Elliot is behind this, and a case could be made that Elliot was the first person to try to break up the Joe Budden, Rory and Mal podcast. But as things kind of evolve, Joe starts to outline how Rory stepped out of place and that he should not be negotiating on behalf of the show. This is not a conversation that happens in a vacuum, as if you don't remember, Tidal initially did try to sign the Joe Budden podcast to Tidal, but it fell through.
Rory says that he had a meeting with Elliot to discuss Tidal, and then he called and told me about it, and I screamed on him. He's absolutely right. I screamed on him. He was totally out of place. He should not have done that. I had already been having discussions with Tidal. I named a number. They weren't the fondest of it. And here goes Rory to sit down and talk to Elliot, but he doesn't own it, and he doesn't know how much it's costing to run these things, and he don't know what type of money I'm going to take. So I 100% said to Rory, please do not do that again. Please do not be used as a pawn when people are trying to do their negotiating tricks. I've already spoken to them. I said a number. That's true. That's true. And when I came back to say, hey, we have a Tidal deal, it's because Hove called. Not because you sat with Elliot. It's because the highest person in the food chain called and said, this is how I feel, present it to your guys. So that's what I did. And you guys wanted to take that Tidal deal. That Tidal deal was for $40,000 a month. $40,000 a month is what that deal was for, with no information being given. Y'all wanted to take it. I said no.
So then later on, down the line, because they couldn't get them on Tidal, it appears that they try to get another deal for free through their sleeper segment. And whether Rory did so intentionally or was played by Elliot, he ends up doing a playlist for no money at all. essentially undermining the value of the Joe Budden podcast. Could it have been that Rory was just played by Elliot, or did Rory feel entitled to negotiate on the show's behalf? And I must say, as a lot of people call me a Rory Venger, I kind of see where Joe was coming from and think that Rory probably shouldn't have done this. But then I also see Rory's side, as I'm thinking like, hey man, do I really have to let you know about a sleeper thing that I'm doing? Technically, it's a playlist, and one of the biggest critiques that Joe Budden had of Rory and Mal was how they never did anything outside of the show. Let me know what you think in the comments. And this isn't the only thing that is noteworthy of this podcast episode, as one of the things I found interesting was that Ice is there and Parks is there. So this was the early building blocks of a dynamic that would become known later on in the show. Also, like I mentioned previously, Mal was in LA at the ESPYs and let Joe know on short notice, which to me kind of illustrates that, Mal wasn't taking the podcast seriously, but also illustrates that Joe Budden was afraid to broach this subject. Very, very interesting to me, because this is one of the core aspects of why the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Mal fell apart. The chemistry is what made it special. It wasn't a business, even though it was. I don't think the two parties, the Rory and Mal faction and the Joe Budden faction, broached business conversations in a way that was substantive, because they were so interested in building the chemistry. Now, the chemistry would be really great, but it would start to subside as the business became unclear and murky. Also, 444 album drops. I think it's an interesting time capsule that the whole album is dropped around this time. Gives you a sense of how old this episode is. And we also see what Joe Budden would probably call a brokey version of himself, as he's talking about returning things to Bed Bath & Beyond and Nordstrom's and Kith. That's right, Balenciaga Joe is not coming until many years later. So let me know what you think. When you were listening to this episode, did you kind of get the sense that something bigger was going on? Or did you feel like it was just a funny segment? Because that's one of the issues I have now when I'm covering a certain situation. Many people are like, Danny, it's just jokes, it's just funny. Well, this title discussion was probably funny to a lot of people. However, it illustrated a real situation, one that was core to the breakup. Miscommunication, not properly speaking about the lines on the show. Rory seemed to think that he was someone who could negotiate on behalf of the show. Was it because he overstepped his boundaries, or did Joe Budden make false promises to him when they first started the show together? That's why when I cover the current iteration of the Joe Budden podcast and y'all say I'm reaching, would y'all say I was reaching if I had done a video about the title situation all those years ago? I'm sorry, but sometimes the science needs to be done, even if it isn't clear in the moment. With that said, y'all, follow me on Twitter to Stop TV. Follow me on Instagram to Stop TV. And I also wanted to end this video by highlighting something Julian said on the Rory and Mal podcast. He said that I was trying to start beef between him and Imani.
I really mean it. I don't listen to any of these hip hop pod. I don't care about this like that, those pods and shit. But not on a disrespectful tip. Like even Danny, I respect Danny, but I stopped listening to his videos because it's like it's too much. It's too much fodder. But there was at one point, who was it? It was like something Flip said about me, and Imani said something, and then Danny made a video about it, and then he tried to get us to go back and forth, and I was like, I don't.
Yeah, Julian, I think you reached. I think a lot of these podcasters out now taking the tack that I'm starting beef between them. No, you guys are starting beef between each other to get that click rate up, to get that money up, and you know that. Julian, I mean, you were the one who commented on, Joe during that whole Savon debacle, and then Imani commented on you. You guys have to take accountability. Stop blaming it on the bloggers. You guys always want to blame the bloggers. The battle rappers did that. Come on, y'all. Let me know what you think about that. Do you feel like Julian has a valid point? Or is he just trying to rewrite the narrative to feel better about whatever he's doing? With that said, like I said before, follow me on all my socials. This is Danny from The Stop. Peace.